Welcome to the TenakaKaiSan's History of Warfare channel. This episode will delve into the details of a specific instrument of war. This category of documentary is aptly called TenakaKaiSan's Instrument of War Evaluation. This episode is titled The Gale Cometh. Alright, well, I'm pretty excited about this one. The Ki-84 fighter is a lesser known Japanese aircraft of World War II, and it is one of my favorites. This aircraft was the best mass-produced fighter fielded by the Japanese Army Air Force, or JAAF, during the Pacific War. Some historians have argued that provided with the proper raw materials and high-octane gas, the Ki-84 was the best piston-engine fighter of World War II. Indeed, by the time this aircraft was fielded, the materials and fuel issues in Japan were distressing. This was due to the American bombing of Japanese infrastructure on the home islands, and more importantly, the wholesale destruction of her merchant fleet. Because of this tightening of the noose, materials such as molybdenum and nickel were in extremely short supply. However, when built right and topped off with quality fuel, the Ki-84 was a sight to behold in flight. The Ki-84 Hayate, or Gale in English, was codenamed Frank by the Allies. For those of you not in the know, the Allies used code names for Japanese aircraft to make communication easier. Fighters and scout planes were given men's names, and bombers and flying boats were given women's names. The Frank was a Type 4 fighter, and the aircraft were designed and produced by the Nakajima Aircraft Company based on new requirements for a well-balanced fighter required by the Army in 1942. Fighters leading up to World War II were generally either light fighters, Ki-43s, or heavy fighters, Ki-45s or the Bf-110. Both of these aircraft types had their pros, but as combat revealed, they each had too many cons. Enter the well-balanced fighter. By mid-war, all belligerents had them, as a product of the realities of air combat as it evolved in the Second World War. These aircraft were tough, fast, well-armed and armored, and very maneuverable. They were the best of both worlds and became the norm for fighter design and development. The Japanese Army Air Force's most successful well-balanced fighter was the Ki-84 Hayate. Clarifying the term Type 4. As mentioned, the Hayate was a Type 4 fighter, or Yanshiki Sento Kai. The Japanese used the term type not as a class, category, or version, as the Western powers did, and this title can be misleading to the uninitiated. At first glance, the Type 1 aircraft, the Ki-43 Oscar light fighter, and the Type 2 aircraft, the Ki-44 Tojo heavy fighter, must equate to the Type 4 being the balanced fighter or medium fighter type. If that was the case, then why was the older Ki-27 fighter a Type 97 aircraft? The type was a designation of the year in which the aircraft was introduced. Now, to most of us on the Gregorian calendar system, a plane fielded in 1937 shouldn't have a type value of 97, but rather 37. The Japanese at the time were using the imperial year system, which was begun in 660 BC of the Gregorian calendar. This meant that 1937 to the Japanese was the year 2597. So moving forward, the Ki-43 as a Type 1 aircraft meant it was fielded in the year 2601 or 1941. Therefore, the Ki-84 was fielded in the year 2604 or 1944 at Type 4 aircraft. Design and development. The Frank was the first Japanese Army Air Force aircraft to incorporate several relatively new concepts into its design. These included an armored headrest and bulletproof glass on the front of the cockpit canopy. The Frank was equipped with the Nakajima Ha-45 Model 11 Homare engine, turning a large four-bladed propeller, the first for a Japanese Army Air Force fighter. The Homare was potentially a game changer. It was rated at 1900 horsepower. Unfortunately, the engine was prone to excessive cylinder temperatures at full power. Eventually, the developers and the mechanics in the field deduced that the issue seemed to stem from the carburetor. Now, these problems went away if the plane was flown at less than full power, but that workaround handicapped the pilot in normal operations in aerial combat. When the aircraft was using high-octane fuel, the cylinder temperature problem disappeared and the Hayate could be used as designed. The very real problem for the Japanese from mid-1943 onwards was that the ability to procure high-octane fuel was abysmally inadequate. The Hayate was to be plagued with this issue. Although the Japanese had planned to equip the Frank with different engines, the war ended before any were flown, with the exception of a single Ki-116 fighter. This variant was a Frank airframe housing the less powerful but more abundant Mitsubishi engine, rated at 1,500 horsepower. Armament. Like any aircraft developed at the time, the Frank underwent several modifications through its short career. These were reflected in different variants. The general armament of the Frank was 2 synchronized 12.7mm Ho 103 machine guns in the cowling, with 350 rounds per gun, and one 20mm Ho 5 cannon in each wing. The 20mm cannon used by the Frank was arguably the best 20mm aerial cannon of the war. Each 20mm cannon had 150 rounds of ammunition. The 12.5mm machine guns were the same caliber as the American 50 caliber guns. The Ho 103s boasted a higher rate of fire than the 50 caliber machine guns, albeit with a lighter slug. Other variants of the Frank with different armament were: the Ki-84 Otsu was a very limited run of Franks with 4 20mm Ho 5 cannons. This provided this variant with a much harder punch. The Ki-84 Hai was armed with 2 20mm Ho 5 cannons and 2 30mm Ho 155 cannons. The destructive power of this variant was considerable. Another variant was the Ki-84 Tai, which had the same basic armament of the Otsu with an additional 20mm cannon angled upwards at 45 degrees behind the cockpit to allow it to be fired at the underside of Allied bombers during night fighting sorties. The airframe. The Frank was an exceptionally sleek aircraft. Every effort was made to make this airframe as aerodynamic as possible, and looked and was more robust than its predecessor, the Type 1 Ki-43 Oscar. The Frank was less stubby than the Type 2 Ki-44 Tojo, and when compared to Japanese Navy fighters, it was more streamlined than the A6M0 or Zeke, less portly than the J2M Raiden or Jack, and less boxy than the N1K1 Shinden or George. The entire aircraft was covered in stressed skin metal, with the exception of its control surfaces, which were cloth covered, as was the standard for the time. The canopy was well designed and provided the pilot with an excellent field of vision. The landing gear was a bone of contention, however, for some pilots. When the aircraft landed hard, the landing gear was prone to collapse or buckle. The developers placed the blame on the inexperienced pilots landing a fast and heavy plane too hard. Now this could be true, and under the capable control of even an average pilot, landing gear collapsed less frequently. Regardless, most other Japanese aircraft had landing gear robust enough to handle similarly hard landings, with the clear exception of the N1K1J Shinden fighter. As the war deteriorated further for the Japanese, another variant of the Frank was designed as the Ki-84 and had several sections replaced with plywood and wood when duralumin became scarce. The Japanese also built 3 Franks with the designation Ki-106, which saw the structure of the plane built entirely out of wood. Indeed, the Ki-106 was 1,000 pounds lighter than the standard all-metal Ki-84. By the numbers. Approximately 3,400 Ki-84s of all variants were produced in the last 20 months of the war. This is an amazing feat of construction, considering that factories and assembly plants were being routinely bombed by the Americans by that stage. In contrast, the Ki-43 Oscar fighter was in production for nearly 4 years, and only 2,520 more Oscars were built than Franks. With over 3,400 aircraft built, some were used after the war by the Chinese and by Indonesia for their own air forces. Only one Frank exists in the world today. It is on display in the Tokuhaiwa Kinenkan Museum on the southern tip of the southernmost of the 4 principal islands of Japan. Toe-to-toe. The culmination of this documentary is how the Ki-84 fared in combat. Although the Frank tangled with American fighters on many occasions, since the Frank looked so much like the Oscar, Tojo, and the Ki-100, American airmen had a hard time reporting back to their commanding officers as to which of the 4 aircraft types they had tangled with. Due to this, confirmed Ki-84 kills are impossible to confirm. Overall, the Franks held their own against the F-4U Corsair and the F-6F Hellcat when piloted by pilots with experience similar to the Allied pilots they faced. It has already been outlined that by the time the Franks were being thrust into combat, their production quality had suffered and their fuel was subpar for optimal performance. Another very important consideration is the poorer quality of pilots that were being produced by the JAAF by 1944. The average Japanese pilot was expected to suit up and defend his country with a maximum of 150 hours of training time. Alternatively, the American fighter pilots averaged 450 hours of flying time before joining battle. This situation only became more dire as 1944 transitioned into 1945. Most new Japanese pilots in 1945 had only 100 hours flying time before battle. This is a far cry from the same flying school programs of the late 1930s, where a Japanese pilot could easily accumulate 500 hours of flying time during training. It also reflected a nearly insurmountable disparity with the American pilots they were facing. The Ki-84 had a better rate of climb than the F-4U Corsair, F-6F Hellcat, P-51 Mustang, and the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Hayate could outturn any of these Allied fighters. The Frank was comparably as fast as any of these aircraft as well. The Hayate's top speed was 390 miles per hour in level flight. However, after the war, a captured Frank was evaluated by the American. What the Americans found was that a Ki-84 with proper maintenance and high-octane fuel could maintain 427 miles per hour on war emergency power. Comparatively, the Corsair could attain 446 miles per hour, the Hellcat 391 miles per hour. The Frank pilots did not have the experience or training to adequately use this powerful and potent instrument of war that was at their literal fingertips. Many an American pilot, in engagements over Japan, noted that the less experienced Japanese pilots were definitely not employing the normal skills a Japanese pilot from earlier in the war were adept at. In conclusion, the Ki-84 Hayate was an extremely capable aircraft that was the Japanese Army Air Force's go-to fighter in the defense of the home islands. One can imagine, under different circumstances, that the Frank could have been a more prominent player in the history of warfare. Thank you for watching. If you want to see a specific instrument of war covered, send us an email. If you like what you watched, then subscribe. If you want to support this channel, please click the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below and support the TenakaKaiSan's channel as you see fit. As this episode ends, I'm TenakaKaiSan. I hope you learned something and enjoyed yourself while doing it. War is hell. Let's all take heed not to forget.